Hello again. We're very, very honored and excited today to welcome the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who is the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, is currently head of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York. And Mr. Rudd's just had an incredible career in politics and international affairs, and we're really grateful to have him here today to speak with the Dean. They're going to be talking about leading in times of crisis and our civic duty to really uplift the most marginalized of us. You know, this is something the Cathedral has been doing tremendously during the whole COVID crisis. And we're working really hard to meet the needs of the community, and we look forward to hearing Mr. Rudd's global perspective. As a reminder, if you have questions, please send them to me through the chat function, and we hope to have the time to get to them, but if not, we can always pass along offline. And right now, I'd like to pass it over to Dean Daniel.
Thank you, Priscilla, and welcome to Kevin Rudd. So for tonight, I'm Dan and he's Kevin, and we're having a conversation and welcoming you into that conversation. The first question I have to ask you is, you have served so many communities and a great nation as a leader, and every community and every nation has crises to face. And as someone once said, the leadership is standing in front of a raging fire and having two buckets. One of them is water and one of them is gasoline. The task of the leader is to decide which bucket to use and how much. I've certainly not led a nation. I've led a parish of 100 people, which is akin to a nation, and I've led a cathedral. But Kevin, do you think that's a fairly apt description of what leadership is about?
I think, Dan, it gets us part of the way there.
All right.
If I had those two buckets, I could also say that the bucket full of water in my case would also have been full of holes as well. So there's a third degree of difficulty for you.
Sure.
But sure, as a pattern of leadership, political leadership, and I suppose leadership at multiple levels, you can either play the card of fanning the flames, which is the easiest trick in politics, sort of either the left or the right, and join the populist throng, and not actually contribute at all to the substantive resolution of the problem at hand,
right,
but make everybody feel better for a moment. Or you can get into the business of two things. One is taming the flames by things that actually work. But I think where I partly part company from the analogy is that the analogy for leadership is also beyond that of a fireman. You actually have to point to the direction out of the flames altogether. And so I suppose with that slight addition, that's my reframing of your analogy.
Well, that's great. Thank you. I think you, as I read your biographical notes and a little bit about you, you exercised that kind of leadership the first day you were in office as Prime Minister, when you signed the statement and the law for dealing with Indigenous peoples in Australia, which was a bold thing to do on the very first day. How did that go?
Well, like most exercises in political leadership, Dan, you take a deep breath and you see what's going to happen. But if your gut instinct is telling you it's the right thing to do, and it conforms with what you describe from the progressive side of politics with the deep principles of social justice, then while the going is going to be a little rocky, you know you're still sailing in the right direction.
Right.
So for me, with Indigenous Australians, my first act as Prime Minister in Parliament was to deliver a formal apology for 220 years of systematic mistreatment of the first Australians by us white folks. It was a major symbolic for the nation. But a bit like St. Paul in Corinthians, that is, it runs a risk of being a clanging cymbal and a hollow gong unless you follow up with materiality. And so for me, that was a 10-year-long funded program to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in health and in housing and employment and education. In the last 10 years, we've made some real progress on this, not as much as we hoped. But I think the symbol without the reality would have been a dead letter. I think the reality without the symbol would have been a dead letter as well.
You also led Australia through the great financial crisis of 2008. And as I read somewhere that Australia was the only nation that escaped the effects of that great recession. That's another.
Well, as a garden variety Anglican, or what you would describe as an Episcopalian, I make no particular claim to spirituality. But it's important to be reflective at times of national crisis. And part of my reflection was to look carefully at the experience of others in similar times of crisis. I took the cabinet one morning when the crisis first hit on an intellectual tour of John Maynard Keynes and the Great Crash and the General Theory of 1936. And what he did in his reflection on how the stock market crash of October 29 turned into the Great Depression, which in turn turned into yet another world war. And so Keynes had been through this, and he had actually reflected on what you did, which was in a crisis of that nature, you had no alternative but to add to what the economists called as aggregate demand in the economy. So unapologetically, we injected a large amount of stimulus into the economy by one means or another. By the way, I built a new library for every primary school in the country, which you'd call every elementary school in the country.
Oh, good.
Which is kind of good. Wired them all, the poorest schools and the richest schools. Wired them all to the broadband network, set them up for the future. But that was of itself worth 1.5% of GDP and construction jobs in every nook and cranny of the country. So things like that made a difference. So reflection was important and learning from history. There have been some wise old birds in the past, Dan, we should learn from.
Well, we've been talking about leadership, and you've described courage and imagination, integrity as an important part of leadership. And you just mentioned faith, your Anglican roots. Can you talk a little bit about faith in leadership, especially in crisis?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I make no particular claim of I'm a Christian, but for me, I think that's one of the most nonsense traditions in political Christianity that exists and has been throughout history. But I think for those of us who aspire to work in public life, it's important to understand where New Testament principles take us in terms of what I describe as the politics of social justice. So for me, my inspiration are people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Reinhold Niebuhr and those folks. Bonhoeffer's reflection in particular, as a kid going through university and reading letters from prison, the cost of discipleship, and his others. And what he describes, Dan, as the theology of the below, giving voice to the voiceless, and taking action for those who cannot act effectively for themselves. So do we apply that perfectly in politics? No, because politics is a business of continuing secular compromise to preserve the piece of the common wheel. But within the framework of the politics of compromise, just continue to steer the ship in a direction which makes it easier for our Indigenous brothers and sisters, makes it easier and better for people who have no money to get a decent education and a first-class universal healthcare system, and to do something about poverty in the world through what we do with international development assistance. So as others have said before us, the arc of history bends slowly towards justice. I think our job in the scheme of things, those of us who aspire to political leadership from a Christian perspective, is to help the arc on a bit in our allotted span.
Right.
And that's what I sought to do.
Well, you wrote a great article on Bonhoeffer in the Monthly, a periodical in Australia. And it's a fascinating article. And in it, you talked about muscular Christianity. That's how you rather referred to Bonhoeffer. What does muscular Christianity look like today?
I think it's, those in the Christian church of whatever breed, and by the way, I grew up as a Catholic, I married an Anglican, I've never resigned as a Catholic, I go to an Anglican church, so yeah. I'm of no fixed denominational abode, I'm kind of just mainstream. But I think muscular Christianity is a bit like this. If you see that there are deep principles alive in our faith which require action, then there are two alternatives we have in life as individual Christians. One is to say it's his job or her job to do that. And the other approach is to say, well, actually, it's my job. By muscular, I mean kind of muscling up to the challenge. And it might be huge. In the United States, where I've lived the last 5 years in the great city of New York, the questions of race are real. I mean, I see that, I know that. So what do you do in practice in order to make that better in your daily life, and how you give and how you contribute and how you become socially and politically active? For me, this is kind of a seamless mission, as opposed to a quietistic, pietistic retreat into, the Christianity and the spirituality of the private confessional, which might make you feel good in the end. You might write a good poem, but I'm not quite sure that actually helps bend the arc of justice.
Well, in that vein, in dealing with muscular Christianity, which is not just about me and Jesus, it's about me and the world and how we serve the world. How do you think the United States has responded to the COVID crisis? What's your assessment of that so far?
A little hard for me to judge, Dan, because I came back to Australia in the second half of March. So my views are derived from what I read. So I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, I watch CNN. I have to confess here in full public view, I do not watch Fox. So therefore, my views will be colored by that experience. What I see in America is, what I see so often is a whole bunch of courageous action by frontline workers in health. And I see a whole lot of courageous action by not-for-profit and Christian organizations and charities. But when I come to the political sphere, but this is no partisan comment, because I've got a stack of friends who are Republicans and many who are Democrats, even though I align with the center-left in this country. I think the world at large has been deeply disappointed by the failure of presidential leadership in the United States. You see, those of us in the world, guess what? We worked out a while ago, you Americans are not perfect. I hate to let you all in on this, but we've observed long enough to know that you're not perfect. But you know something? In the history of superpowers, America has been pretty good. If I look at the evolution of the post-45 global order, America has played an extraordinary global leadership role. And often there are flaws and there are mistakes along the way. But when it came to the COVID crisis, this massive eruption of not just a domestic crisis in America, of public health and economic dimensions, but a global crisis to public health and the global economy. The reflex reaction of all of us is to look around for America to lead. And we didn't see it this time. That's saddening for all of us.
It was rather the perfect storm of an unanticipated crisis, and in my assessment, a leader who was not ready or able to deal with it, and a population that was scared to death, and everything just fell apart in a lot of ways. So I hope, and I'll have to say, I trust, as I read American history, I trust the American people. We don't always stay on track, and we wander off a bit and get grumpy and do violent things that we wouldn't do otherwise. But in the end, I believe the pendulum, while it may swing to the right for a while, swing to the left, it finally settles back toward the middle. And I think that's, at least for me in my read of history, that's one of the great things about this nation, that we may wander away for a while, but we somehow come back to the middle eventually.
Yeah, I have great confidence in your country's future as well. I mean, I've always been pro-American. As I said, not through some rose-colored set of glasses,
right,
because I understand what's wrong in America domestically and where things screw up internationally from time to time. But I think in your historical reflection, Dan, it's right. Look at America in the 20s, and look at the great correction which occurred under Roosevelt's New Deal. And the Rooseveltian New Deal, by and large, transcended American politics through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. It really didn't start unraveling till about the 70s and the 80s. And, you know, this great sweep that we've had in the reverse direction since, let's call it the Reagan Revolution, Thatcher Revolution. In a way, it's reached its natural crescendo, where the early crescendo was the global financial crisis, where we saw that markets don't solve everything. In fact, they can create calamity. And this time round, in the absence of the strong intervention of government on a public health crisis, guess what? You end up with a disaster. Yeah. So like you, I have some confidence that there is a natural deep reflection underway on the part of the American people, and we'll end up at a better position of equilibrium as a result, Republicans and Democrats.
Well, this is a little bit different direction. You've been a part of the G20 gathering of leaders of nations. Tell me who the most interesting leader you've met.
That's a really interesting question. I don't wish to offend or to damn with faint praise any of them, but I've got to say, as a guy of deep reflection, your guy, Obama, who I got to know really well, was a very thoughtful man. He may not give profoundly intellectual speeches, but there is a lot of intellectual substructure to this guy. And we became friends. And so in a different way, in a completely different way, and given the extraordinary history of her country, Angela Merkel in Germany. Angela is a fascinating story because she's the daughter of a Lutheran pastor who grew up in East Germany. And I've had conversations with Angela about Bonhoeffer when I've been on state visits in Berlin. And whereas she would not wear her Lutheran Christianity on her sleeve, if you look, for example, at her reaction to the refugees crisis, which swept Europe several years ago, I think there was something of a still small voice at work there, because it made no sense for the centre-right party of German politics, the Christian Democrats, to do what she did. So for different reasons, those two, and Gordon Brown also is a good friend and a deeply thoughtful, reflective son of the manse, His father was a Scottish Presbyterian minister. And so there is my trilogy.
A Good Trilogy. I've met Gordon Brown, and he was a rather shy man, not, at least when I met him, not comfortable in front of large crowds, or it wasn't his natural setting. He was very comfortable. But those three leaders, what traits do they share?
A footnote about Gordon first. If any of those tuning into this gathering are interested, at the height of the financial crisis and the London Financial Conference of March of 2009, just over a decade ago, I was in London for that, and it was the conference which broke the fall in the global economy, largely through Gordon's leadership. The night before the conference, or the afternoon before the conference, the Dean of St. Paul's in London asked Gordon and I to address the throng, 2,000 people, on what the hell are we going to do? It's an interesting set of reflections. So I'm sure you'll find that online somewhere, anyone who's interested. In terms of what unites these leaders as characteristics, I think it is across all three of them, there is a lack of arrogance. B, therefore, as I reflect on it, a predisposition to ask questions rather than deliver answers as they're working through a problem. And then C, a quiet calm about once a decision is taken to then prosecute that course. If you look at the measures taken by Obama in the United States and let's call it the cleanup of the global financial crisis, subject to enormous political controversy in the US, by and large pretty effective. Gordon Brown lost his job because of the crisis, but no economic historian today would dispute the role of the conference he chaired at that critical juncture. And so that's important. I remember at that London conference, one other small story. The night before we met, we had dinner at 10 Downing Street. And there was a G20, so there's 20 of us around the dinner table. Obama there, there's the Chinese president there, Merkel there. I'm across the other side of the table, below the salt. But the studied concentration on the faces of most of these leaders who are not into, at that stage, public performance, but how do we wrestle this thing to the ground? It was quite humbling. My small contribution that evening was to say to them, guess what, guys and girls? Our predecessors gathered in their same room for the London Economic Conference of 1933. And we didn't agree back then. And the result was a decade-long depression and another global war. So we can slide into that one if we want, or we can reflect on it and do something different.
Thank you. And now I know our time is running out, but I know something about you that I don't think anybody else on this screen knows, maybe one or two, and that is that you have a golden retriever at home.
Yeah.
And oh yes, is she there? Okay.
She is, yeah.
And two new Burmese kittens.
Yeah, the three of them have periodically invaded various interviews I've done with CNN, the BBC, and it's the hazards of working from home.
Okay. I love it. I love it.
I was in fact doing a serious call with some corporate friends of the Asia Society, where Frank Brown is a good friend, and I know a good friend of the Cathedral. And Frank's with us today in this gathering. And so I was expounding on the current construction of the Chinese stimulus package to representatives of various banks around the world, and suddenly both kittens emerged, one on one shoulder and one on the other. It was not a solemnity-inducing event.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, Frank, as you know, is chair of the Board of Trustees here at the Cathedral, and a great leader himself, for whose leadership I'm personally very thankful, and for his friendship.
Yeah, no, Frank's a good friend, and certainly the Asia Society has been an enormous support. Look, I'm the first foreign barbarian who's led a major sort of institution in the Asia Society. It's an American institution. So trusting an Australian to do that in the first place is kind of odd, given that we don't always play by your rules. But Frank's always prepared to take a walk on the wild side. I presume that's why he's with the Board of Trustees at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which in its history has wonderfully walked on the wild side. So.
Yes, that's true. Bravely, sometimes.
Yeah.
Do we have, Priscilla, do we have time for a question or two?
We do. I think just one question, and Kevin just touched on China. Someone had asked for his observations on the current tensions in the US-China relationship.
I think I'll spend just a minute or two on this one because I'm not sure of your time constraints. In America, there's often an assumption, because of the idiosyncrasies of President Trump, that the US-China relationship is a problem because of Trump. My own view is a little different to that, and that I don't think Trump has helped because of his inconsistencies over time. But actually what's happened is two more fundamental things in the last 6 or 7 years. One is, objectively, China has become more powerful. And its own calculus of the balance of power between itself and the United States causes it to believe, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, that history is on its side, that America is in decline, that China is rising, that China is becoming more powerful, and therefore it can exercise its power in the world more aggressively and assertively than before, both in prosecution of its national interests and its values. And the result is, not just America, but the rest of us are now confronting this new, more assertive, self-confident, and occasionally, well, not occasionally, from time to time, arrogant China. That's one part of it. The second relates to the first, which is Xi Jinping's a different leader from those who have preceded him in the job. I know him reasonably well, having dealt with him when I've been Prime Minister. And I've seen him in small gatherings in Beijing a number of times since then through the work I do at the Asia Society. But Xi Jinping has decided to be a different leader as well. And if I trace the origins of China's, as it were, assertiveness in the world, not only is the power factor relevant that I referred to before, but his personal leadership style is much more in your face. And if I wanted to trace it back to a particular meeting, it was a meeting of the Central Leadership on Foreign Policy, which occurred in December of 2013. Put those two things together, and therefore, second term Obama was dealing with this unfolding reality. First term Trump has had to deal with it frontally. There's a separate question about how America has responded under Trump, and we can talk about that in a different context. So therefore, the China we're dealing with now is actually radically different to the China of a decade ago.
Thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation, and thank you so much for leading us through it. Two things. You had mentioned bending the arc of justice and giving voice to the voiceless. And those two things really resonated for me because I think it's what the Cathedral tries to do in the city, our community, and I think it just nicely encapsulates our mission. And to that end, we're going to be talking about our work in the community, particularly Harlem, on August 6th with Gail Brewer, who's the Manhattan Borough President. And I hope you'll all join us. It'll be at noon. And again, I want to thank you all for participating, and we're very grateful to all of you. So take care.
Kevin Rudd, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your wisdom and your leadership.
Dan, Mr. Dean, thank you for your leadership and leading a wonderfully provocative, but also pastorally deeply engaged church in the great city of New York.
Yeah. Thank you. And good morning.
Good morning from Australia. Good evening in America.
Yeah.
All the best. Thank you.
And to you.